Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and before we get into talking about today's video, I do just want to briefly comment on the shocking news that came out yesterday that brought the hockey world to a complete standstill. I was actually going to post this video yesterday, but it seemed wildly inappropriate to post a what should be fun video on the day in which we learned of the tragic passing of Columbus Blue Jackets star forward Johnny Gaudreau and his brother Matthew. Gaudreau was an elite hockey player on the ice for both the Blue Jackets and prior to that the Calgary Flames, having put up 115 points in a particular season, which is just an absolutely incredible achievement. But even more than that, Johnny Gaudreau was an outstanding individual off the ice as well. And so my thoughts, as well as the thoughts of all fans around the world, are with the Gaudreau family during this unimaginably tough time. Now, when it comes to this video, I will be carrying on with my Q&A. I announced a few days ago, I asked people if they would be interested in this type of video since I'd never done it before, and the response was warm enough, and I got submitted a decent amount of questions, enough that if I had done a dry run through of every single question in one video, it would take about an hour, and that is a lot to ask of people to actually watch, to sit down and watch me just ramble on stream of consciousness style for an entire hour. It's not necessarily something that most people are looking to do. So instead, I decided to split the questions into three categories. The first of which is the more personal questions relating to me and my relationship with the San Jose Sharks. The second category is the more prospect-based questions about players like Celebrini, Smith, Musty, these guys. And then the third category is the more general questions, either relating to, let's say, the Sharks for this upcoming season or at some point into the future. Now, there will be some carryover between the categories. Some people decided to ask more than one question in their single comment, which I'm perfectly fine with, but what ends up happening is that their first question might be more personal, the second question might be more prospect-based, and so it's difficult to really decide which category to put that question into since I don't want to separate any of them. And so there will be some carryover, there will be some questions that stand out a bit, but hopefully I've done my best organizing them the way that they should be. So this will be a three-part video, and we start off today with the more personal questions and start off with a very important one here for sure, coming from Sharks Oregon, who asks me, am I actually a professor? And the answer to that is officially no. I do not have any sort of official documentation that refers to me as a professor of anything. There is no degree in Sharks hockeyology or anything like that, but unofficially, considering I did call my channel Professor Hockey, you know, there's nobody who's going to stop me from calling myself a professor, so I guess I'll leave it at that. The next question comes from Scott TV, who asks me, do I live in San Jose and have I been to a game recently? And the answer to both of those questions is a resounding no. I do not live in San Jose. In fact, I live up in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, which is just about as far as you can get from San Jose, California, while still being in an NHL city. And with that being said, considering the Sharks only make the trek up to Montreal once per year to play against the Canadiens, I haven't really seen too many games recently. I believe the one from last year took place in like late October, if I'm not mistaken, so it's been almost a year since then. So don't really get a lot of opportunities to see the San Jose Sharks in person, but they are such a fun team anyway that I've gotten hooked all the same. The next question comes from It's a Gundam, who asks me, what position would I play if I played hockey? Now, in my younger years, I did play some hockey, not ice, but street hockey, and I always loved the position of goaltender. I just liked the idea of kind of being in your own bubble, in your own sort of one-on-one game, you against the puck, just trying to stop it in any which way possible. Forwards and defensemen, they got to worry about like systems and positioning and their teammates and their passes and everything like that. You're a goaltender, you stay in your one area, you play pretty much the entire game unless of course you actually get pulled, and you just get to worry about yourself. Now, of course, the idea of having to face off against a ton of like 80, 90, 100 mile per hour slap shots multiple times per game kind of brought me out of it a bit, and that's probably one of the reasons, amongst many of course, why I never really pursued being a goaltender in any sort of professional sense, and that's really how I've ended up here now talking about the game of hockey instead of actually playing it. The next question now comes from Ben on Twitter. He asked me if I'm interested in any other sport, and the answer to that is not really anywhere close to my interest in hockey. For hockey, I watch the Sharks play all 82 games during the season, even on days in which the Sharks aren't playing, or on days that they are but their game is a bit later or a bit earlier in the day. I'll still tune into other regular season games. And then, of course, the NHL playoffs are something that I'm interested in watching too, even if the Sharks aren't participating in it. So the 8 months that are reserved to the NHL season, that's pretty much all I am doing. But there are other sports who I do like to kind of watch the big events of. For instance, every year the Super Bowl for football is something that I do tune in for, even if I don't really watch any other game. The World Cup of Soccer every 4 years I do enjoy, or like the Euro, things like that. And also, I'm a big fan of the Olympics. Those concluded actually just a few weeks ago, the Paris 2024 Olympics. Those are very, very fun, but I don't actually follow any of the individual sports from that until 4 years later when the next Olympic Games actually roll around. So it's pretty much just all hockey for me as my favorite sport by far to watch. The next question that Ben asks is whether or not I actually view on trying to transfer this channel into more of a career, or if it's sort of more of a hobby for me. Well, the answer to that currently is that it is definitely much more of a hobby at the moment. I'm not exactly rolling in cash from this YouTube channel. However, in a perfect world, perhaps it could be transitioned to something more of like a sports analyst type of position. But at the moment, I'm really not too worried about that. I'm more just focused on trying to make this channel as best as it can be, and with the San Jose Sharks improving going into next season, and hopefully much more so over the next few years, I'm hoping that the videos will get even better than they have already been. The next question comes from Bay Area Sports Fan, also on Twitter, who asked me who is my all-time favorite San Jose Sharks player. Now, this might be a bit of an interesting and weird answer, but I honestly don't really have a favorite player in the more traditional sense. There's not one player who really stands out above the rest as, wow, I really loved watching this guy. There are a bunch of different Sharks players who I did enjoy when they were on the team. Couture, Burns, Thornton, Marleau, all of these types of guys, but there isn't, let's say, that one massively heralded player on the team at some point. If I had to choose an answer, I'd probably go with Joe Pavelski. I really like his story as a player, having been drafted in the 7th round and yet having been able to make a huge impact with the San Jose Sharks. 30-40 goal scorer at times, one of the most unrivaled players in the league when it comes to tipping pucks into the net, and how he managed to do so even with the significant sort of deficit in his game, which was his skating. Usually most prospects can't overcome if their skating is just kind of average, not even like necessarily below average, but just kind of average. Pavelski was anything but fast. You could immediately recognize him on the ice by how slow he would actually move, and yet he thought the game at such a high level that it didn't really end up mattering, and he managed to carry on his outstanding performances even up to the day he retired with the Dallas Stars at the age of 40, or I believe very close to the age of 40. So an incredible career for Joe Pavelski. I wouldn't necessarily say he's my favorite player, but definitely he's very much high up there. The next question comes from user Clue, who asks me, when did I start watching the San Jose Sharks? He actually asked a few questions, and that is the first one. I started watching the San Jose Sharks back at the end of the 09-10 season, so about 15 years ago at this point, and I caught the 2010 playoffs. That was the year in which the Sharks beat up on the 8th seed Colorado Avalanche in the first round. There was that own goal from Dan Boyle, which is perhaps one of the most notable moments of that first round, but otherwise the Sharks handled them pretty well. Then in the second round, they actually took it to the Red Wings in just 5 games, which was extremely impressive considering the Red Wings the previous year had made it to the Stanley Cup Finals, and the year before that had won the Stanley Cup. And so it seemed as though I had caught on to the San Jose Sharks at the right time, as they were well on their way to trying to get a Stanley Cup that year, especially had they made it to the Stanley Cup Finals. The Philadelphia Flyers, the team from the East who made it, weren't necessarily that impressive. Unfortunately for the Sharks, they ran into the brick wall known as the Chicago Blackhawks in the Western Conference Finals, and this was the beginning of the Chicago Blackhawks dynasty, and they really took it to San Jose, knocked them out in just 4 games, a complete sweep of the Sharks, but still a very interesting and fun playoffs to watch, and definitely got me hooked onto some Sharks hockey. The second part of this question was my favorite memory from the San Jose Sharks. Now, there's a very easy answer to that. That, of course, would have to be the Game 7 against the Vegas Golden Knights a few years ago. That insane comeback against them, down 3-0 with 4 straight goals on the very same major power play that then eventually led to the overtime game winner by Barclay Gaudreau. It's very hard to beat that. That was like drawn up absolutely perfect from a narrative sense. If you want to kind of move past that, considering it's such an easy answer, I'll give a different one. Back in 2011, in the early parts of me watching the San Jose Sharks, round 1 against the Los Angeles Kings in the playoffs, game 3, the Sharks fell behind 3-0 in the first period, then 4-0 very early on into the second. It seemed as though the game was pretty much just over right then and there, but the Sharks responded with a 5-goal second period that tied the game up at 5 before a Devin Setoguchi overtime winner would win it 6-5 and put the Sharks up 2-1 in that series, eventually leading to a 4-2 series victory over the Kings in that first round of those playoffs. So that was definitely a very exciting comeback for sure, especially since it happened relatively early on from when I started watching the Sharks. So definitely one of my favorite memories of the Sharks as well. And then the final question, who are my favorite broadcasters and whether or not I actually model my sort of presentation style against any other broadcasters. Well, the first part of that is, of course, as being a Sharks fan, I'm a big fan of Randy Hahn. I also liked his duo with Drew Remenda when they were doing so. I believe Remenda ended up getting fired a few years ago by the San Jose Sharks, though over the last couple of years he has returned. And I also think that with the departure of Brett Hedican this offseason, Remenda might move into more of a full-time role as that duo gets reunited, Hahn and Drew Remenda. So I definitely like the two of them together. The other part of this question, whether or not I'm sort of modeling my presentation style after different broadcasters, the answer to that is really not really at all. I'm kind of just sort of trying to keep to my own self, just doing what I think is best, and so just relaying information the way I know how to do. Whether or not that is inspired by anybody, I don't really think is the case, but you never know what kind of like subconscious type of inspiration I may have gotten. But at the moment, it's not like I have one person in mind for that. And then the final question of the day, Shark House asks, who on the Sharks do I think deserves to have their number retired? I imagine this is a question relating to players currently on the Sharks, but also who have been on the Sharks in the past. Now, at the moment, the San Jose Sharks only have one number retired. That is Patrick Marleau, which they did last year, and I do believe he was deserving of that, having the most ever games played in the entire league, not just amongst the San Jose Sharks player, is a pretty impressive achievement. And going into next year, the Sharks will also be retiring the number of Joe Thornton, another one that is definitely very deserving. Thornton is not only one of the best playmakers the NHL has ever seen, but one of the best players the NHL has ever seen as well, as he's right up there in terms of total points throughout his career. So very, very deserving. However, past those two players, I'm honestly not sure if anybody else is worthy of such a sort of legendary type of ceremony. The fact is that there are a few Sharks players who I'd say are relatively close. For instance, Brent Burns, Logan Couture, Joe Pavelski. But to me, having your number retired should be really the ultimate achievement of your career. And I think you really have to have done something special to actually be able to have gotten to that point. Brent Burns was a really productive player for the San Jose Sharks, put up a ton of points, was their number one defenseman for so many years, even won a James Norris as the league's best defenseman. But would I put him in the sort of the history books as a legendary San Jose Sharks player? I'm honestly not too sure. The next would be Logan Couture, who has had many great seasons with the San Jose Sharks, has been the captain of the team for the last few years. Perhaps if back in 2016 the San Jose Sharks had indeed won the Stanley Cup and Couture would have been given the Conn Smythe, which probably would have happened just based on his point total, at that point maybe he could have had an argument, but without that MVP style of performance in the playoffs that would get the Sharks their first ever Stanley Cup, I don't think he has quite the individual statistics to actually be able to reach that point and to get that number up in the rafters. The player who might be the closest would probably be Joe Pavelski. He was an absolutely incredible player for the San Jose Sharks, and he was indeed the captain that brought them to that Stanley Cup Finals. But again, it goes back to what I said about Couture. Had they won the Stanley Cup that year, he may have had a greater argument. But again, I don't think the individual statistics are quite there for Pavelski to actually be worthy of this ceremony, of this immense achievement. Because, to me, if you're going to be allowing these players who were very, very good, but not necessarily at that higher level, you're going to end up retiring a lot of different numbers. Imagine the Sharks raise 8 to the banners and 88 and 39. Then perhaps you go back into the Sharks past and you raise like number 20 for Evgeny Nabokov. And then as you look forward into the future, the Sharks have some really talented individuals coming up through the system. Celebrini, Smith, Eklund, these types of players. If you're going to be starting retiring them because they're putting up 80-point seasons, now you're retiring 71 and you're retiring 2 and you're retiring. And it just kind of goes on and on and on. And eventually you end up having no numbers left. So I think it really should be reserved to the very, very special players. Marleau, definitely Mr. San Jose. Joe Thornton, very deserving, one of the best players of all time. 12 and 19 will never be worn again by San Jose Sharks players. But again, don't think anybody else is quite at that level. But that will do it for this part 1 of this Q&A, the personal questions out of the way now, and we move on to tomorrow, where I will have the prospect-related questions. Class dismissed.